living testament to the United States Army's unprecedented triumph in the Gulf War. Certain victory, almost 20 years in the making. A victory won by magnificent soldiers, superbly led and armed with the best our nation has to offer. Certain victory, the most convincing evidence of the American style of war, a style characterized by the ability to project overwhelming force anywhere in the world. Certain victory, a unique style of fighting that crushed a formidable foe in record time, jealously guarding the lives of American soldiers and reviving American pride in its Army for the first time in nearly 20 years.
Good evening, Saudi Arabia.
Everybody's really ready. Talk to me.
Our Army took only 100 hours to reestablish itself as the most successful combat force in the world. Moving armored and mechanized forces more than 60 miles per day, the Army doubled the renowned Wehrmacht's best blitzkrieg effort in World War II. Heliborne forces placed combat elements more than 160 miles deep in history's greatest aerial envelopment. The Army utterly destroyed the largest force it had ever faced in the shortest ground war in modern history. The Desert Storm victory forever laid to rest the troubled ghosts of Vietnam.
Very, very proud of those officers who really stuck with it in those dark days of the early 70s and worked to make this happen.
Vietnam was important because for us older guys it was the last touchstone. We certainly had that reinforced there, but it's been something that's always been important.
As the Army emerged from the malaise of the Vietnam era, a generation of soldiers stuck it out through some tough years and dedicated themselves to rebuild their Army. They directed the Army's attention away from fighting in the jungle. They recognized the value of the indirect approach in combat. All too often, American soldiers' lives were wasted in bloody head-on fights. Victory at low cost could be achieved by striking an enemy where he was weakest. They sought to create a ground equivalent to the Navy's successful Top Gun program, where soldiers could be similarly tested against a realistic foe.
2 bunkers.
Their dream was born in 1980 with the creation of the National Training Center.
There, they teach you and train you in desert warfare, which helped me a lot.
2 bunkers.
I believe the National Training Center is the mecca of the Army. I believe that I just love going there to train.
But true renaissance in the Army still needed an influx of modern weapons. General Creighton Abrams, the Army's Chief of Staff, took up this challenge with his designation of the Big Five weapon system. The M1 Abrams tank, the Bradley fighting vehicle, the Black Hawk and Apache helicopters, and the Patriot air defense missile emerged in the early 80s. All 5 also emerged triumphant from the Gulf War, yet true reform called for more than just weapons. Air-land battle doctrine expanded Army thinking beyond the close-in fight in an effort to be able to fight outnumbered and win. Its tenets of initiative, depth, agility, and synchronization modeled the way the Army would train and fight.
The most important thing we should do and must do as leaders is to put our troops and to put our units in the best possible configuration to win.
The successful airborne strike in Grenada in 1983 marked the start of the Army's long climb back to respectability. Army soldiers fought as they had been trained with initiative and great valor in multiple small unit engagements. In December 1989, the Army once again showcased its growing professional competence during Operation Just Cause. Near simultaneous attacks on 27 separate objectives by airborne and air assault forces were executed flawlessly, exactly as planned. Success in Just Cause was only a glimpse of what the Army would demonstrate barely more than a year later in the Iraqi desert.
Iraq will not be permitted to annex Kuwait. And that's not a threat, it's not a boast, it's just the way it's going to be.
Quality soldiers ensured certain victory. From private to general, the men and women of Desert Storm were the best soldiers this country has ever produced.
I came away with an understanding that there was nothing that they couldn't lick.
The army that crushed Saddam Hussein's vaunted forces was fundamentally different from the army that struggled out of the quagmire of Southeast Asia 20 years earlier.
In response to Saudi Arabia's request for protection from Saddam Hussein's aggression, American soldiers from all over the United States and from stations overseas, National Guardsmen, reservists, and active duty transformed a raw, undeveloped desert into a combat theater capable of sustaining 2 full Army Corps.
By late August 1990, the United States had begun the largest mobilization since World War II. Army soldiers from every state answered the call. During the course of Desert Shield, the country moved the equivalent of the entire city of Atlanta more than 8,000 miles to the sands of Saudi Arabia. More than 500 ships and 9,000 aircraft moved close to 2 million tons of equipment halfway around the world. The Army alone deployed 12,400 tracked vehicles, 114,000 wheeled vehicles, 1,800 aircraft, 38,000 containers, and 350,000 tons of ammunition. On arrival in Saudi Arabia, more than 3,500 convoys moved supplies close to 3,000 miles over the Saudi desert.
We're not the combat troops, but we're supporting them, and we feel that we're doing our part.
1, 2, 3.
More than 70% of the force that built the theater came from the Army National Guard and Army Reserve.
We're a reserve unit, and we never really thought this would happen to us. And now we get to put our training into action, and everybody's pretty proud of what we're doing.
Iraq's brutal attack on Kuwait forced this massive buildup. At 2 in the morning on August 2nd, 1990, the Iraqi Republican Guard divisions rushed across the Kuwaiti border and quickly overran the tiny Kuwaiti army in less than 48 hours. Within days, the Army's 82nd Airborne Division began a deadly race to the defense of Saudi Arabia.
We treat them and view them as a capable military force, but they are not invincible when they're not 10 feet tall.
The 82nd Airborne is a very heavy, has a lot of firepower. A lot of Apaches went in early, MLRS went in early.
We recognized early on that we'd have to get heavy forces in there very, very quickly in order to have a credible deterrent against the Iraqi threat of armor, which the Iraqis possessed in abundance.
Oppressive 100-plus degree heat greeted the airborne soldiers. Covering about the same territory as the United States east of the Mississippi River, Saudi Arabia is one of the world's least hospitable deserts.
We're adjusting to it. We're making this our home.
Critical combat power and mobility came with the 101st Airborne Division's attack and transport helicopters. Soon, the heavy firepower of the 24th Infantry Division from Fort Stewart, Georgia, and the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment from Fort Bliss, Texas, arrived to complete the shield.
It was an absolute bare-bones, austere initial start on that operation. We were in the process of trying to get as many combatant forces in there as possible, so we were taking logistical risk all along, relying very, very heavily on the host nation.
The Desert Shield buildup eventually matched the massive troop deployment to Vietnam in 1965, but instead of taking a full year, it was completed in 3 months.
In the last 60 days.
Major General Gus Pagonis, the Army logistician on the ground in the theater, rapidly tapped the Saudis for host nation support. Eventually, the Saudi government alone provided 4,800 tents, 1.7 million gallons of packaged petroleum products, 333 heavy equipment transporters, 20 million meals, and 20.5 million gallons of fuel per day.
We are happy to help as much as we could the American soldiers who came here to support us, to defend us, and we are glad that the Americans has come over here.
Army drivers pushed vital supplies forward to the combat troops now deployed close to the border with Kuwait. National Guard and Reserve soldiers made up the bulk of the logistics force.
We're stockpiling different types of rations, different types of supplies and equipment to support the troops.
General Pagonis directed the development of a series of logistics bases to move material from the ports to the foxholes.
These log bases became the background and the concept that we would use in the Gulf War.
By early September, Saddam Hussein's opportunity to attack Saudi Arabia was all but lost. The largest single global combat deployment in history by land, air, and sea effectively slammed the door on Iraqi aggression.
Historically, armies tend to fight the current war in much the same way in which they fought the last, often with disastrous results. The United States Army broke this mold dramatically in the Gulf. Years of reform winnowed the chaff from the wheat so that only the best lessons from the past found their way into the campaign plan for Desert Storm. General Schwarzkopf began to craft the plan nearly 4 months before the ground war.
While the Desert Shield buildup continued, General Schwarzkopf assembled a special group of planners to devise a way to wrest Kuwait from Hussein. He said, assume a ground attack, study the enemy and the terrain. Tell me the best way to drive Iraq out of Kuwait. One of the lessons of the Vietnam War was that no military operation should be contemplated without a clearly defined objective. The Army would apply air-land battle doctrine to eject Iraq from Kuwait by striking deep into the enemy's rear, simultaneously with attacks in areas least expected.
We knew that our mission was one of defeating in detail the Iraqi army that confronted us, and in the process of doing that, we would liberate Kuwait, and then our job was done.
In 2 short weeks, Hussein had flooded Kuwait with 8 divisions, over 140,000 troops, 1,100 tanks, and 610 artillery pieces faced the coalition. It was a huge force backed by Scud missiles and the constant threat of chemical weapons. Planners could count tanks, troops, and artillery, but measuring the Iraqi will to fight was not so easy. Clearly, the vaunted Republican Guard, Hussein's elite, would fight. The Army had learned to fight in the desert at the National Training Center.
Do doctrinally sound cavalry tactics. It opened up a whole new arena of training and learning for us.
By October, defensive strategy gave way to offensive plans. A second corps was projected to join the 18th Airborne Corps with the objective of destroying the Republican Guard, Hussein's vital center of gravity. From Washington to the desert, the 2-corps plan took shape with growing support. Then on November 8th, The President announced the deployment of the 7th Corps from Europe, bringing the projected combat force to more than 270,000 soldiers. By November, Hussein's force had grown to 28 divisions, with almost 60% of his army in defensive positions in the Kuwait theater of operations. Iraqi engineers constructed formidable defensive belts of wire, fire trenches, and minefields.
Our mission is dangerous. There is no doubt about it. We're well trained. We have several battle drills, but if we're forward attacking and there is a minefield or an obstacle, it will be the engineers that will be called forward to breach the obstacles.
Very hard to defeat this mine. He's got this mine is mine in '84. We saw they bought 7 million of. He also captured a bunch more from the Iranians, and he got a model called the SP-81 from the Kuwaitis. It's dark green.
Hussein's plan was to lure the coalition into a frontal assault up the Wadi al-Batin, which he would then crush from the flanks with armor forces from the Republican Guards. Schwarzkopf's plan fed this illusion. While the air operation blinded Saddam, the army would shift its 2 corps 200 miles to the west. Close to 300,000 soldiers and 50,000 vehicles would execute one of the most complex moves in the history of war. Logistics bases, stocking everything needed for 60 days of war, would go in first under the cover of the air operations.
Just a mission that we had to do, just like other missions before.
Hey, let's be ladies.
Army leaders built a game plan that was sure to win. Every soldier knew his mission.
We had a good plan. We'd worked the plan. Everybody understood it from PFC to general. Everyone participated in putting it together.
Training, drills, and rehearsals built confidence in the plan, leaving nothing to chance and giving young soldiers a chance to practice before the